Mist hung low over the Appalachians like a shroud, curling through the skeletal branches of trees that had seen centuries pass in silence. The mountains were beautiful, but they held a secret, one that only whispered at night, carried by the wind through the hollowed valleys and forgotten hollers. In one of the most remote hollers, a house stood alone, its windows dark, doors bolted, and porch sagging under the weight of years. No one remembered exactly when he arrived. Some said he wandered in like a stranger lost in the fog, polite, soft-spoken, the kind of man who could make the most wary neighbor lower their guard. But beneath that polite exterior lurked something ancient, something patient and hungry. And soon, he found his way into the lives of two sisters, quiet and trusting, whose laughter once filled the holler like a song. The first subtle warning came in small gestures, a door left slightly ajar, a hand resting too long on a shoulder, a suggestion that made the sisters question their own instincts. Then came the pregnancies, one after the other, and with them a darkness that no one could name. For 20 years, the mountains bore silent witness to a horror that was hidden behind smiles and polite greetings, a horror that twisted love, family, and trust into something unrecognizable. The holler knew whispers, the woods knew secrets, but it was only when the sun finally pierced the mist that the true extent of the nightmare began to emerge. The arrival in the Appalachians is not simply a matter of geography, it is an immersion into a world that feels suspended between time and shadow, where the mountains themselves seem to hold memory and judgment. From the moment one begins the long, winding roads that twist through dense forests and fog-laden hollows, there is a palpable sense of isolation, a quiet that is almost too complete, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant howl of an animal. It is a place where modern life feels faint, where cell signals vanish and towns are scattered like forgotten memories, each with its own wary traditions and unspoken rules. The landscape shapes the people just as much as it conceals the secrets that thrive within it, steep slopes and hidden hollows providing both shelter and a stage for events that the wider world might never witness. Into this secluded realm comes the figure who will forever alter the lives of two unsuspecting sisters, a man whose presence initially seems benign, almost incidental, blending with the quiet rhythm of rural life. At first glance, the holler offers little to suggest danger. It is picturesque, with streams that cut through moss-covered stones, wooden cabins that lean with age, and forests that stretch so densely that sunlight barely touches the ground. Yet beneath this veneer of serenity lies a sense of latent unease, the kind that residents learn to live with, a tension woven into the very soil. The sisters, raised in this environment, understand the nuances of their world, the subtle warnings in a stranger's glance, the need to respect boundaries, and the traditions that govern daily life. But the arrival of this man introduces a variable that cannot be accounted for, a disruption to the delicate balance maintained by isolation and familiarity. While the mountains are home to stories of survival and resilience, they are also fertile ground for fear, rumor, and control, and the holler quickly becomes a theater in which power and vulnerability will be tested over decades. The sisters' lives, once intertwined with the rhythms of seasonal work, local gatherings, and family routines, begin to shift imperceptibly under the influence of an outsider whose motives are opaque, whose presence will gradually dominate their choices, movements, and freedoms. In a place where neighbors are few and help is distant, the holler's seclusion amplifies the stakes of every encounter, every decision, and every moment of trust or hesitation. The arrival is not merely physical but a quiet infiltration into the social and emotional fabric of the sisters' world, setting the stage for a story of manipulation, secrecy, and a darkness that will linger unseen beneath the Appalachian mist. The first encounter between the sisters and the man was deceptively ordinary, almost mundane, yet it carried the weight of a moment that would ripple through their lives for decades. He appeared in the holler with an air of quiet confidence, moving with an ease that made him seem unremarkable at first glance, blending with the rhythm of the community without raising suspicion. There was something about his demeanor that drew attention not through loud gestures or demands, but through a subtle, almost imperceptible presence that suggested familiarity where there should have been none. When the sisters first met him, it was in passing, a brief introduction that lingered in memory longer than it should have. He asked polite questions, smiled in a way that seemed both warm and knowing, and spoke in tones that conveyed understanding, giving the impression of someone who could be trusted. Small gestures, a hand extended to help with a task, a comment that acknowledged their efforts, A look that lingered just long enough to unsettle but not alarm laid the groundwork for an influence that would slowly grow over time. The sisters, accustomed to the rhythms and quiet expectations of Appalachian life, did not immediately perceive the subtle tension that followed him like a shadow. He learned their habits, the times they ventured alone, the moments they were most vulnerable, and in doing so, began to insert himself seamlessly into their routines. Over time, the ordinary exchanges, the casual greetings, the brief visits, the shared chores, began to take on a weight that neither sister could fully comprehend. What initially seemed like friendliness began to carry an undercurrent of control, a slow encroachment on autonomy masked by the appearance of normalcy. The holler itself, silent and observant, offered no intervention, and the few who might have noticed the nuances of his behavior either dismissed them as inconsequential or were too distant to intervene. By the time the sisters began to sense the unusual persistence in his attention, it was already woven into the fabric of daily life, a constant presence that felt impossible to ignore. This first encounter, though brief and seemingly benign, marked the inception of a dynamic that would evolve into a complex web of manipulation and dominance. Every smile, every polite gesture, every careful observation of their routines contributed to the gradual erosion of boundaries, establishing a foundation upon which fear, coercion, and control could later thrive. The initial meeting, innocent as it appeared, was the seed of a nightmare, a seemingly ordinary interaction that would quietly grow into a decades-long pattern of manipulation and horror. The slow entrapment of the sisters began almost imperceptibly, a process so gradual that neither they nor the people around them could fully grasp its extent until much later. At first, it was the small things, gentle suggestions that seemed harmless, subtle guidance on decisions that appeared mundane but carried weight over time. He would comment on who they could trust, what places were safe, and how they should behave around neighbors, framing his advice as protection while simultaneously isolating them from the wider world. The sisters, raised in a community where caution was a necessity and strangers were often viewed with suspicion, initially accepted his guidance as thoughtful concern, never realizing that it was a deliberate strategy to weaken their independence. Over months, the man's presence became a constant, a quiet but insistent shadow over their lives. He learned their schedules, their habits, and the moments when they were most vulnerable, tailoring his interactions to ensure compliance while minimizing resistance. What began as casual visits and conversations gradually extended into longer, more intrusive encounters, with the sisters finding themselves compelled to spend more time in his company, often under the guise of helping or socializing. Each step was measured, calculated to create dependence without triggering alarm, and over time, the sisters' autonomy was subtly eroded. Isolation deepened as the sisters' ties to the community weakened, neighbors' questions were deflected, friendly visits declined, and the sisters' world contracted to the boundaries he controlled. His influence extended to shaping their perceptions of right and wrong, instilling a sense of fear that discouraged rebellion while framing his authority as necessary or inevitable. The slow entrapment was reinforced by emotional manipulation, a careful mix of kindness and intimidation that made it difficult for the sisters to recognize danger. They were caught in a web that appeared safe on the surface but concealed layers of coercion and control, each thread meticulously placed to tighten the hold. Over time, the holler itself, with its dense forests and quiet roads, became a backdrop to the sisters' constrained existence, amplifying the sense of inescapability. The man's patient persistence, the gradual withdrawal from familiar support systems, and the consistent undermining of confidence combined to create a psychological cage that the sisters could not easily escape. By the time the full weight of his control began to manifest in tangible ways, the foundation had already been laid through years of subtle manipulation, calculated attention, and relentless encroachment on their freedom. The slow entrapment was not marked by a single dramatic event but by countless small, almost invisible acts that accumulated into a force capable of dominating their lives, shaping the trajectory of the horror that would unfold over the next 2 decades. The first pregnancy marked a turning point in the sisters' lives, a grim milestone that transformed the subtle unease of their existence into a tangible, undeniable reality. Until that moment, the manipulation and control had been largely psychological, an insidious weaving of fear, dependency, and subtle coercion, but the pregnancy made the consequences painfully physical and irrevocable. It was not a sudden event but the result of years of calculated influence, a gradual erosion of autonomy that left the sister vulnerable to decisions she might never have made on her own. The realization of the pregnancy brought with it a mixture of confusion, fear, and shame, emotions compounded by the Holler's isolation, the absence of nearby support, and the pervasive sense that no one could intervene. She was alone in the most intimate and terrifying way, her body now bearing the visible proof of the man's control, and with it, the unspoken knowledge that her life would no longer be entirely her own. The first signs came quietly, almost innocuously: missed routines, changes in her body that she initially dismissed, subtle doubts that she could not reconcile with her understanding of her own life. As awareness grew, so did the psychological weight, layering guilt and fear with the growing realization of danger. The man's response was measured, carefully designed to maintain dominance while projecting concern, giving the impression that he alone could guide her through the uncertainty that he himself had engineered. This dynamic entrenched his power further, reinforcing the cycle of dependency and control, and creating a scenario in which the sister's sense of choice was increasingly illusory. The pregnancy was not merely a biological event but a symbolic assertion of his influence, a concrete manifestation of the 2-decade-long pattern of manipulation. The Holler, with its sparse population and distance from intervention, became a silent witness to this encroachment, its isolation amplifying the sister's entrapment. Friends and neighbors noticed subtle changes: less frequent appearances, quiet avoidance, a reluctance to share even mundane details, but the true nature of the situation remained hidden, obscured by the combination of the man's careful orchestration and the community's deference to privacy. As the sister moved deeper into pregnancy, the stakes rose, the psychological tension thickened, and the consequences of rebellion became increasingly severe, reinforcing the sense of inescapability. The first pregnancy was the fulcrum on which the trajectory of horror tilted, a point where manipulation transformed into concrete, life-altering reality, and where the pattern of control that had been forming for years solidified into a chain that would shape not only her life but the lives of all those who would come after, leaving the Holler itself heavy with an unspoken dread that would linger long after the initial shock. The second pregnancy deepened the horror, transforming what had already been a hidden nightmare into an almost unbearable reality. By the time the younger sister became pregnant, the pattern of control and manipulation was firmly entrenched, and the mechanisms of fear and isolation had taken full hold. The first pregnancy had already shifted the family's dynamics, creating an atmosphere thick with tension, secrecy, and quiet despair, but the second confirmed that this was no isolated incident. It was a sustained, deliberate campaign of dominance that would define the sisters' lives for decades. The arrival of the second child's conception was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, concealed beneath the daily routines of chores, errands, and the rhythms of Appalachian life. The sisters had long been subject to the man's psychological control, his calculated attention to their vulnerabilities, and his steady reinforcement of dependency, but now that control extended into the tangible, corporeal realm, leaving them both marked in ways that were impossible to ignore or undo. The community, distant and sparse as it was, began to notice odd patterns, whispered absences, unexplained changes in behavior, and the quiet withdrawal of the sisters from gatherings and neighborly visits. But the true scope of the horror remained hidden, camouflaged by the Holler's traditions of privacy, its respect for personal matters, and the fear of offending a man whose outward demeanor was often unassuming or even courteous. The second pregnancy intensified the psychological grip the man had established, embedding layers of guilt, fear, and confusion in the sisters' daily existence. Each visit, each interaction, each carefully calculated gesture reinforced his authority, ensuring that the sisters remained compliant even as the weight of the situation grew heavier with each passing day. The first pregnancy had planted the seeds of entrapment, but the second made the cycle undeniable, a repetitive pattern of abuse that seemed unstoppable within the Holler's isolated terrain. The sisters' bodies, their choices, and their very lives became instruments in a prolonged, meticulously orchestrated scheme of control, with the surrounding forests and mountains serving as silent witnesses to decades of unseen suffering. The second pregnancy was a confirmation of power, a stark demonstration of the man's ability to manipulate, intimidate, and dominate, and it cemented the trajectory of fear, secrecy, and domination that would persist over the years. In this way, the second pregnancy was not merely an extension of the first but a pivotal moment that solidified the horror, entrenching the sisters in a reality from which escape seemed inconceivable and leaving the holler itself heavy with a darkness that stretched beyond the immediate family, touching the very air and soil with the weight of long-hidden malevolence. The subtle suspicions of the community began to form long before the full extent of the horror was known, as neighbors noticed patterns that did not fit the rhythms of everyday life in the holler. At first, the changes were easily dismissed: occasional absences from local gatherings, a quietness that seemed unusual but not alarming, the sisters' hesitance to speak openly about their lives. Appalachian communities often operate on trust and familiarity, and residents tend to respect privacy, even when small anomalies appear. Yet over time, the accumulations of oddities became harder to ignore. Whispers began circulating, small conjectures that carried weight precisely because no one could see clearly into the sisters' household. The man's presence was increasingly noticeable in these quiet observations. He was always near, always polite, always observant, yet always keeping a careful distance that prevented direct confrontation. The neighbors' attention often shifted between curiosity and unease, as they tried to reconcile the man's outward civility with the subtle tension that seemed to cling to the sisters whenever he was present. The first hints of concern emerged when one of the older residents mentioned noticing a pattern in the sisters' behavior. They no longer lingered at communal gatherings, their laughter was subdued, and their appearances at church or local events had become sporadic. Attempts at inquiry were met with evasive answers or carefully phrased reassurances, a strategy that deepened the sense of unease while preventing concrete intervention. The isolation inherent to the holler amplified these suspicions, as the neighbors were physically close enough to notice changes but distant enough that true understanding was obscured. Small incidents, a missing tool, an unfinished chore, a hurried visit, were interpreted with a growing sense of worry, each one a fragment of a puzzle that the community could not yet assemble. Children's questions, hushed conversations in the evenings, and passing remarks in the general store all contributed to an undercurrent of anxiety that spread quietly through the holler. While no one could articulate the full truth, the pattern of control and fear was beginning to be sensed intuitively, a collective recognition that something was wrong without the knowledge of its magnitude. This creeping suspicion established a backdrop of tension that would later collide with the shocking revelations, showing how long manipulation and abuse can operate in secrecy, even under the watchful eyes of a community. The holler itself became a character in this awareness, its quiet roads and thick forests both shielding and revealing small truths, creating an atmosphere in which unease simmered beneath the surface, preparing the ground for the eventual exposure of horrors that had remained hidden for decades. The decades of control unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, yet their effects were relentless, shaping every aspect of the sisters' lives and embedding a deep sense of fear and dependency that grew with each passing year. The man's influence, initially subtle, became increasingly pervasive as he learned to manipulate not only their actions but their thoughts, emotions, and perceptions of reality. Over time, the sisters' world contracted, their routines dictated by his presence and expectations, and the holler's isolation made external intervention nearly impossible. The mountains themselves seemed to enforce this dominance, the dense forests and winding roads creating both physical and psychological barriers that reinforced the sense of inescapability. In the early years, small acts of compliance were rewarded with fleeting moments of apparent kindness, reinforcing a cycle of trust and fear that anchored the sisters to his control. These gestures were never consistent or predictable, however, and the alternation between indulgence and intimidation ensured that the sisters remained constantly vigilant, never fully at ease, never able to reclaim the autonomy that had been stripped away. As time passed, the pregnancies and the resulting children became further instruments of control, binding the sisters to roles and responsibilities imposed by someone who had systematically dismantled their ability to resist. Each day carried with it the weight of obedience, each interaction a careful negotiation between survival and defiance, though the latter was rarely possible without consequences that reinforced submission. The community, aware of hints and fragments, remained largely on the periphery, unable or unwilling to intervene in a situation that appeared at once private and inexplicably controlled. The man's persistence was methodical, measured in decades rather than moments, and it was this temporal scope that made the control so absolute. The sisters' identities, their relationships, and their sense of self were gradually subsumed by a life dictated by fear and manipulation. Over 20 years, every resistance, every flicker of independence, was met with subtle coercion, reminders of danger, or quiet intimidation, reinforcing the notion that escape was impossible. The psychological pressure, the constant surveillance, and the enforced isolation created a living environment in which trauma accumulated silently, unseen by outsiders, yet omnipresent in daily life. By the end of these decades, the holler had become a stage upon which the slow, deliberate exercise of power had unfolded, leaving scars that were physical, emotional, and generational. The pattern of dominance, cultivated over years of careful planning and exploitation, ensured that the sisters remained enmeshed in a web of fear and dependency, their lives shaped irrevocably by a control that was measured not in days or months but in decades, a relentless shadow cast over everything they once knew, a shadow that would define the narrative of horror that enveloped the holler and its people. The attempts at escape were desperate and fraught with risk, each effort underscored by the overwhelming weight of fear that had been meticulously cultivated over years. The sisters, though trapped within the confines of manipulation and isolation, retained fragments of defiance, brief moments in which the thought of freedom flickered like a fragile flame against the suffocating darkness. Their earliest attempts were tentative, almost imperceptible, a pause in obedience, a quiet questioning of authority, small gestures that tested boundaries without fully revealing their intentions. These initial acts of resistance were met with immediate and calculated responses from the man, subtle warnings disguised as concern, fleeting punishments that reminded the sisters of the consequences of defiance while never appearing overtly violent. The psychological grip tightened with each effort, the holler itself offering both sanctuary and obstacle, its dense forests and winding roads creating physical barriers while also providing the illusion of possibility, a cruel mirage of escape that seemed simultaneously near and unattainable. Over time, the sisters' attempts became bolder, fueled by the cumulative weight of fear, frustration, and longing for autonomy. Secret trips to neighboring towns, whispered conversations with trusted outsiders, or moments of clandestine planning were all carefully orchestrated yet perilous, each movement shadowed by the possibility of discovery. The man's vigilance, honed over decades of control, made true freedom nearly impossible, and each thwarted attempt reinforced the sisters' sense of entrapment. Emotional manipulation compounded the difficulty, as he cultivated dependency and guilt, framing their desire to leave as disloyalty or betrayal, ensuring that even when physical escape seemed plausible, psychological chains remained unbroken. Each failed attempt added layers of fear and shame, embedding the idea that resistance carried unbearable consequences, and over time, the sisters became adept at masking intentions, navigating a delicate balance between outward compliance and internal yearning for liberation. The holler, with its remote paths and few witnesses, amplified the stakes, turning even minor actions into potential threats, making the risk of exposure terrifyingly high. The pattern of attempted flight and immediate containment created a cycle in which hope was nurtured briefly, only to be extinguished by swift and calculated reinforcement of control. These repeated efforts at escape, though ultimately unsuccessful, were pivotal in demonstrating the sisters' resilience and the depth of the psychological imprisonment in which they lived, showing how long-term manipulation could entrench fear while also igniting the persistent, flickering spark of resistance. Each attempt, each failed effort, each fleeting moment of courage became part of the broader narrative of endurance under extreme coercion, illustrating the complexity of captivity that extended far beyond physical confinement into the deepest recesses of mind, emotion, and identity, shaping a prolonged struggle against domination that would define the holler's dark history for decades. The final revelation of the horror that had taken root in the holler arrived like a slow-burning conflagration, spreading shock and disbelief through a community that had long sensed unease but could not have imagined the full magnitude of what had occurred. 4 years, the man's influence had operated in silence, carefully concealed beneath a veneer of politeness, occasional kindness, and ordinary routines. Neighbors had noticed small anomalies, changes in behavior, withdrawn appearances, subtle absences, but the true scope remained hidden, obscured by the holler's isolation and by the manipulations that masked the sisters' suffering. When the truth finally emerged, it was both sudden and inevitable, a convergence of evidence, confession, and circumstance that shattered any illusion that life in the holler could remain untouched. The revelation often began with whispered disclosures, fragments of information shared cautiously by those closest to the sisters, or a sudden observation that could no longer be ignored. As more details surfaced, the horror became undeniable. Decades of manipulation, control, and abuse, pregnancies imposed upon the sisters, and the systematic stripping away of autonomy that had defined their lives for 20 years. Shock reverberated through the community as the narrative crystallized, leaving neighbors grappling with disbelief, guilt for missed signs, and anger at the audacity and cruelty of the perpetrator. Authorities, when involved, were confronted with layers of complexity, from the decades-long concealment to the intertwined emotional, psychological, and social dynamics that had allowed such control to persist. The revelation did not merely expose a crime, it illuminated the mechanisms of power, fear, and manipulation that had held the sisters captive, showing how isolation, careful calculation, and subtle intimidation can combine to create conditions in which abuse can flourish undetected. For the sisters, the revelation was both liberation and trauma, a confrontation with decades of stolen years, interrupted trust, and violated innocence. The holler, too, felt the weight of exposure. The mountains and forests that had silently witnessed years of secrecy seemed to absorb and reflect the horror, their quiet presence amplifying the lingering sense of dread. Community members struggled to reconcile the image of the man they had known, the seemingly ordinary neighbor, with the perpetrator of unspeakable acts, and the dissonance created a lasting unease, a tension between memory and reality that could not easily be reconciled. The final revelation became a defining moment not only for the sisters but for the entire holler, marking the end of prolonged concealment and the beginning of reckoning, healing, and a reckoning with the profound ways that fear, secrecy, and manipulation can shape lives in places both isolated and unsuspecting, leaving scars that extend far beyond the immediate victims, touching the fabric of the community itself and altering its perception of safety, trust, and the hidden potential for darkness within familiar places. Even after the truth had been exposed, the aftermath of the horror lingered in ways that were both tangible and intangible, leaving a shadow over the lives of the sisters, their children, and the community that had quietly observed the slow unraveling of control for decades. The holler itself seemed altered, as if the mountains, forests, and winding roads had absorbed the weight of the trauma and now carried it in the stillness that had once offered concealment. For the sisters, freedom did not arrive in the form of immediate relief. Instead, it came tangled with the lasting consequences of manipulation, fear, and psychological domination. Their sense of self, shaped and distorted by years of coerced dependence, required painstaking reconstruction, a gradual process of reclaiming autonomy while confronting the memories that haunted each corner of their former lives. Daily routines, once dictated by the man's control, now needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, yet even mundane decisions were burdened by the weight of past intimidation. The community, too, faced its own reckoning. Those who had sensed something wrong, who had glimpsed the subtle indicators of coercion but lacked proof or authority to intervene, wrestled with guilt and regret, questioning whether they had done enough or whether the isolation and secrecy of the holler had rendered them powerless. The story of the sisters became woven into the collective consciousness, a cautionary narrative that reminded residents of the hidden dangers that can fester even in familiar landscapes. The children, born into circumstances shaped by decades of control, carried both genetic and social legacies of trauma, their lives inextricably linked to the patterns of manipulation that had preceded them. Healing required not only addressing immediate safety but also untangling the intricate web of psychological damage, mistrust, and emotional scars that extended across generations. The holler itself, with its dense forests and quiet roads, remained a silent witness, a landscape forever imprinted with the memory of prolonged abuse, shaping how residents viewed privacy, trust, and the limits of intervention. Even years later, the echoes of fear persisted in whispers, in the cautious interactions among neighbors, and in the lingering awareness that appearances can conceal profound darkness. The man, removed from the equation, was only one component of a story whose impact stretched far beyond his presence, affecting every aspect of the sisters' lives, the well-being of their children, and the perception of the community that had both protected and overlooked them. Ultimately, the aftermath was a testament to the enduring consequences of long-term manipulation, a reminder that trauma does not end with exposure, that freedom does not erase memory, and that in places where isolation and secrecy allow darkness to flourish, the legacy of horror can persist long after the initial acts have been brought to light, leaving lives, landscapes, and communities indelibly marked by what transpired behind closed doors.